Welcome in, Bears fans. This is 85 at 40. This is a special single season series that Second City Gridiron is kicking off today. Very excited to be a part of this series. You're going to see a lot of me on this series. You're also going to see a lot of Jeff Berkus. You're going to see a lot of Lester Wiltfong. We are the old heads of Second City Gridiron, so we know probably too much there is to know about the 1985 Chicago Bears. So we are going to have this series. It's going to go throughout this season, all the way into the playoffs, and it's going to be celebrating the 1985 Chicago Bears. We're at the 40-year anniversary of this Super Bowl team, probably really the last opportunity we're going to have to really celebrate this team when you get to the 50th anniversary and stuff. It starts to get a little too far away. We're probably a little too far away now, but that's okay, because this team was something special to the city of Chicago and really the NFL as a whole. And look, I understand the rhetoric of the 85 Bears has grown a little tiresome, especially for younger Bears fans, especially for Bears fans that didn't experience this team. And I'll be honest, I'm at about the youngest age. I'm 47 years old. I'm at about the youngest age of someone who could remember this team and experience this team. My family had season tickets. I was able to go to multiple games that season. I was able to go to the Washington game. Bears won that one 45-10. I was at the NFC Championship game against the Rams where the Bears won 24-0. And I was fortunate enough, I was at Super Bowl 20. We had end zone seats really low to the field, like third, fourth, fifth row. And I was in the end zone where William Perry plunged in for that, what became a controversial touchdown years later when we realized the situation with Walter Payton and how much it meant to him to getting a touchdown and Mike Ditka getting caught up in the moment. But let's talk about this team for a little bit and what we're going to do. So throughout this season, we are going to have guests on to celebrate the 1985 Bears. We'll do some media people. We're going to do a lot of former players who were on this team. Maybe we'll do some opponents. We're going to look at this team any which way we can and celebrate this team about how good this team was and how they were a dominant team for their era and could not exist in another era. I mean, yes, this team could have existed in earlier eras. This team can't exist in 2025. The rules have changed. Things that the Bears did are wildly illegal now. The Bears punished quarterbacks for 4 quarters for 16 regular season games and 3 playoff games. That's what they did. The amount of roughing the passer penalties they would have now doesn't mean the Bears were dirty. They were playing within the rules as they were constructed in 1985. But this is just not a brand of football that exists on today's field. Like the Luther Burden block in preseason against Damar Hamlin. Everyone's like, oh, look at the pop he had on that. That's how this defense hit players every play, multiple players per play. It was just that kind of attacking feel. I mean, you go on YouTube and watch some of the Wilbur Marshall hits on quarterbacks from a blitzing linebacker. It was an absolutely brutal sport. It is not the same sport that we see now. And I think that was a big aspect of this 85 Bears, was that brutal aggressiveness, that they had that junkyard dog mentality that they embraced. They were barking at offenses across the league throughout, especially during the cold weather. That was something that they embraced. It's something that was part of who they were as a team. And that's what made them unique. And it wasn't just that, it was the personalities. It was Walter Payton, who was, one of the best players in the sport, and a top 2 or 3 player, him, Joe Montana, best non-quarterback, arguably, him or Lawrence Taylor in the sport. Payton still looked at as one of maybe the top 5 players in NFL history. Jim McMahon, a massive personality, and he's going to come up throughout this podcast series, McMahon, because his statistics, and it sounds like a cliche thing. Oh, back in my day, this player was, you don't know how good this player was. For Jim McMahon, it's really, you don't know how good this player was. Like Walter Payton, you see the career statistics, you see the MVP, you see the things that back up how great he was. And obviously, I'm not putting McMahon in Peyton's category, but McMahon was a fantastic quarterback. When healthy, this guy was a top 10, top 12 quarterback in the league, which is what you want. The problem was Jim McMahon couldn't stay on the field. Jim McMahon was 11-0 in 1985 as the Bears, Bears quarterback, 11-1. But no, 11-0. Yeah, he was 11-0 because Fuller started that game and then McMahon came in against the Dolphins. He was 11-0 as a starter, and yet he still missed 5 games because that was the issue. McMahon couldn't stay on the field, partially because of how he played. He just lowered his head and slammed his body around. But what was the most fascinating thing to me about this team was the personalities that made it on the defensive side of the ball. Like, we can talk about McMahon and we can talk about Peyton and how key this offense was. Mike Ditka ran the offense and Buddy Ryan ran the defense. But the personalities on the defensive side of the ball, the Otis Wilson, a huge personality. The front 4, every one of them was a huge personality. Richard Dent, Dan Hampton, Steve McMichael, William Perry, of course, a rookie in 1985, a phenomenon once Ditka put him in the backfield and had some fun with him there. So this 85 Bears team was just something special. It just resonated with the city. It resonated nationally with the league. The Super Bowl shuffle, of course, comes out in November. In late November, they put that out. That's how confident this team was about what they were going to be able to accomplish on the football field. And what they did accomplish, they go 15-1. Of course, the loss to the Miami Dolphins on Monday Night Football. And we'll get into that again as this series progresses. I think that Monday night game was interesting because you hear a lot now as documentaries have come out about Mike Ditka and Buddy Ryan being on opposite, sides of an argument. Mike Ditka wanting Buddy Ryan to go to a nickel. Add that was not as popular to do back then, especially, Buddy Ryan wanted to stick to his guns and run his defense. Mike Ditka wanted him to protect against the pass better. Buddy Ryan wouldn't do it. Dan Marino, of course, torches him. They score 38 points. And that's the one black eye on this team that kept them from going undefeated. Of course, the Dolphins get knocked off by the Patriots in the AFC Championship game. And I think the Chicago Bears really wanted to see the Miami Dolphins in that Super Bowl. They wanted their revenge. They wanted to be like, that was not us. That was a blip on the radar. And this is us. And they wanted to beat the snot out of the Miami Dolphins. They didn't get that chance. So instead, they settled on absolutely embarrassing the New England Patriots. The Patriots couldn't move the football all season, all game long. I believe they had negative yards at halftime. Only touchdown came, their field goal came after a Walter Payton fumble. They went 3 and out, but they were in field goal range and were able to kick 3 points there. And the touchdown came in garbage time in the fourth quarter. There was absolutely nothing that offenses can do against the 85 Bears. And out of every stat about the 85 Bears, the one that stands out to me the most, the one that I love the most is this one. And it is, when you look at the playoffs, the Bears, of course, beat the Giants 21-0, the Rams 24-0, and 46-10 in the Super Bowl against the Patriots. Just looking at defense and special teams, Sean Gale returned a muffed kick from Sean Landetta, a punt, for a touchdown in the divisional game. Wilbur Marshall picked up an Eric Dickerson fumble, returned it about 50 yards for a touchdown in the NFC Championship game. Reggie Phillips, little-known cornerback, was in for Leslie Frazier after Frazier went down with the knee injury in the Super Bowl, gets a pick 6, gets the 6 points there. They also had a safety in the Super Bowl as well. That's how they ended up with 46 points, 5 touchdowns, 3 field goals, and, of course, the safety. That's their 46 points. So when you look at that, you look at a team that's the defense and the special teams scored 23 points in the playoffs and only allowed 10. So forget the offense. The defense itself won every single one of those football games on their own. They 23-10, an absolutely mind-blowing statistic, especially when you consider that the 3 points were on a 3 and out after a fumble. And the touchdown from the Patriots came in absolutely mop-up time, where if the starters were still out there, they wouldn't have scored. In essence, the starting defense, pitched a shutout for 3 straight games. They were an absolutely dominant football team. And we can talk about, they had a stretch a 3-game stretch against Dallas, Atlanta, and Detroit. They won those 3 games by a combined score of 108-3. We can talk about what Walter Payton was able to accomplish as a running back at his age. Truly phenomenal. I think 9 100-yard games in a row for Walter Payton that season. We can talk about the leadership of Jim McMahon. We can talk about Mike Ditka and Buddy Ryan as coaches. There's so many aspects of this team we can talk about. But the dominance that this team had in the playoffs is what really separates it. They, make no mistake about it, other teams have won 15 games and won a Super Bowl. But to win games in the fashion that they did in the postseason, not against bad teams, against playoff caliber teams, they absolutely throttled them, embarrassed them, showed them that they had no business being on the field with them. And it's that postseason dominance where, and again, it's an impossible question, and I'm going to ask this to a lot of people throughout this series. Is this 85 Bears the greatest single season team of all time? And I think it's important to say single season because you can look at what Bill Belichick and Tom Brady accomplished over the years. You can look at what the Steel Curtain did in the 70s. You can look at Lombardi in the 60s with the Packers. You can look at these great teams over the years, even Luckman and Hallis in the 40s. You can look at them and say these were great teams, and they had more success over 4, 5, 6, 7 years than the 1980 Chicago Bears. But for one single season, the 85 Bears, to me, is the greatest single season team in NFL history. Had the Patriots, because the Patriots had that kind of dominance. Had they beaten the Giants, had Brady beaten the Giants in that Super Bowl, I think there's your argument. They would have gone undefeated. There's your argument for the greatest single season team of all time, but they didn't get it done. The Bears got it done, and that's what separates them. For my money, the greatest single season team in NFL history. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to be joined by Chicago Bears historian and longtime writer Dan Pompei of The Athletic. He's going to kick this series off. This is Bears 85 at 40. Bill Zimmerman. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the first episode of 85 at 40. I'm your host, Bill Zimmerman, and there's no better person to start this off with than a longtime Chicago Bears writer. He's been in part of the Chicago media landscape for many years. He knows this team. He knows Chicago Bears history inside and out. He is Dan Pompei of The Athletic, and he joins me now. Dan, Bill Zimmerman, welcome to 85 at 40.
It's good to be with you, Bill. Good to be talking about the 85 Bears, as we've been doing for the last 40 years. It's a story that never gets old, and it's always fun to talk about.
Yeah, it really is, because there's just something about this team. And I know the city of Chicago love this team dearly, and we'll get into that a little bit. And maybe the rhetoric has grown a little tiresome for some of the younger fans, mostly because there's been such little success since 1985 to 2025. But, you know, I was a kid when this team was a huge deal. And I love this team, posters on the wall, you know, everything. And there was something about this team that kids and the city just really gravitated towards. I don't know if it was the defensive dominance, if it was the personality, if it was guys like Walter Payton and Jim McMahon on offense. What was it for you that made this team? It's not like this is the only team that's won 15 games in NFL history. What was it about this team that just set it apart?
No, it was kind of the perfect storm. I don't know that in my lifetime I've ever seen another NFL team or even sports team quite like it, that captured the imagination of so many people. You know, as you mentioned, it had star quality, obviously, with some of the greatest players of all time, Hall of Famers left and right. It had a coach who kind of embraced the whole idea of showmanship and let his players show their personalities and had fun with it. And of course, he's a Hall of Famer himself and a great former Chicago Bear. You had a cutting edge scheme that really, you know, left a lot of offenses unable to cope with it in many ways. And then you had just great players at every position and so much personality throughout the team. The team came along at a time, I think, when there was a lot of exposure that wasn't there previously. You know, it was kind of like the advent of the age where you had sports talk radio and ESPN and some of these other things, and the media was growing, and we were starting to get to know athletes in a way that we didn't previously. So it just had so many things going for it that made it a phenomenon that was unlike anything I think that had ever been, and probably has never been since.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about this team when you actually look at the makeup of the roster is you've got one of the, I would think most people would say consensus historians, top 5 players in NFL history in Walter Payton running the football and what he was able to do to help with ball control. And at that age, it's not like he was 26 years old. He was in his early 30s at that point. So you had this, but the team is known for its defense and the relentless pressure of the quarterback. So I find that interesting. Like usually if a team's known for a great offense, it's that quarterback or that running back that's associated with it. And I'm not saying that Dent and Hampton and Singletary and these guys weren't known names, but I think it's interesting that this 85 Bears defense is what you think about. But at the same time, you have a player like Walter Payton running the football on the other side.
Well, I think there's a couple of things that work here. First of all, the defense was not only a great defense, it was probably, in my opinion, the best defense of the modern era, and really left opposing offenses and quarterbacks without any answers in how to attack it. And then, the offense made the defense even better, the Bears offense, I should say, and Walter Payton, because it was very complimentary. The ball control style that they played enabled the defenders to stay fresh. This was in the days before they were rotating pass rushers. So those guys were on the field, Dent and Hampton and McMichael, Perry, Hartenstein also rotated in there a lot. They weren't coming on and off the field like they do nowadays. So they were playing a lot of snaps, and they were enabled to be fresh and relatively healthy because the offense took the load off. And it was not only Walter, it was a great offensive line too. They've got one Hall of Famer in Jim Covert. They should have another in Jay Hilgenberg. And it really was a special unit of blockers. And then you had Jim McMahon, who really orchestrated the whole thing offensively and, was just the perfect quarterback and leader for that unit.
Well, let me start on the defensive side of the ball. And I'm going to start with a really basic question, just as kind of a ground setting question here, because I think a lot of younger fans, they know about all the sacks and everything that the 85 Bears generated, but what was the 46 defense? I mean, we talk about schemes and everything nowadays. We didn't talk about it as much then. What was Buddy Ryan's 46 defense?
Well, it was basically a way of overloading blocking schemes. So they had no answer for some of the pass rushers. And they also were able to blitz in creative ways, send different people at different times, and keep quarterbacks guessing as to who was coming. Really keep offensive linemen guessing too, because if they committed one way, they were likely to leave a gap open that someone else could exploit. And it was a scheme that Buddy really started to use with great success in Minnesota when he was the defensive line coach there, and Neil Armstrong was the defensive coordinator under Bud Grant. And Neil came here as a head coach, brought Buddy as his defensive coordinator, and that's when he started to use the 46. He called it the 46 because that was the number that Doug Plank wore.
Right.
And Doug, of course, wasn't around for the 85 Bears, but he was around in spirit because his jersey number was the name of that great defense. And Hampton was such a key to that 46 defense because he would line up in the middle of the field on the center, and one guy couldn't block him, so they had to often commit more than one blocker to Hampton, which now really left them vulnerable to a blitzing linebacker, an Otis Wilson, a Wilbur Marshall, whoever it was. And you just had guys who could win one-on-one battles on top of all that. I mean, yeah, the scheme really helped, but they almost didn't need the scheme. I mean, Richard Dent, do you really need any help to get him free? He could defeat almost any offensive tackle he went against.
Yeah, and let's talk about the defensive line a little bit further, because you brought up Dan Hampton, and I know it's crazy to say this about a Hall of Fame player, but I almost feel like Dan Hampton is underrated because I just felt like he was such a dominant player, had such ability. He could rush from the inside, rush from the outside. You could line him up all across that defensive front. Something that and you correct me if I'm wrong, that I don't think a lot of defensive coaches did as much then. We see it a lot more today. I feel like, you hear that, oh, Will Singletary was the guy in the middle of that defense, and Wilbur Marshall and Otis Wilson with the blitzing and Dent coming off the edge. I don't feel like, Mongo was the spirit of the defense. I don't feel like Hampton's name is brought up quite as much when you can, I think, really argue that he was the best player on that defense.
Yeah, I think you definitely can argue that. I mean, there are some statistics that I don't have handy, but that I researched many years ago when he was a Hall of Fame candidate, that will tell you the Bears, he missed a lot of time over the years with different knee injuries. And whenever he missed time, they weren't anywhere near as effective defensively or really as an entire team as they were with him in there. So he was key to the whole thing. He was just a great player, as you said, versatile. He played outside, he played inside. He was just a wrecker. He wrecked offenses, and I think it all started with him, really. And but so many, that doesn't detract from McMichael or Singletary or Hampton or Wilbur Marshall or Wilson, any of the guys up front. And then certainly, they were getting the job done in the back end as well. So yeah, they had it. They had everything in spades.
Yeah, and that secondary I think is interesting because when you're bringing the pressure like that, obviously you're not, and it wasn't as prolific of a passing, league in 1985, but you still have that situation where you are leaving your cornerbacks out there isolated on an island a lot. And Leslie Frazier and Mike Richardson are guys that they're the last names usually brought up on that defense when you talk about the 11, 12 guys of that key defensive play. You don't talk about those guys as much, but Buddy Ryan really had to trust them that they could stay sticky in their coverage. And yes, the idea was they'd get to the quarterback before the guys had a chance to get open, but you really still had to trust that secondary.
You did, and Frazier in particular was really an outstanding player, and I think had he stayed healthy, that was really, for all purposes, the end of his career with the Super Bowl when he blew out his knee. If he had stayed healthy, I think he would have been recognized as one of the league's best cornerbacks because he came out of nowhere. He was not one of these guys who came into the league in the first round or anything like that, but ended up developing into a really, really fine football player that enabled the Bears, as you said, to leave him isolated against really good receivers. And then, as you say, Richardson, he did his job too for the most part. He was a little more up and down, never quite as consistent as Frazier. But they did enough to get the job done, and certainly they had a lot of help from Gary Fensick and Dave Duerson, and then in even in subsequent years when they got Todd Bell back in previous years, he was a big factor as well.
So let me ask you one more micro question and then a couple big pictures here before I let you go. And the one is about Jim McMahon. And I know you brought him up in one of your earlier answers. And to me, if you just bring up Jim McMahon's statistics, you sit there and go, that's a nothing quarterback. It's just no different than anyone else. But if you watch Jim McMahon play, there was something about him. He knew how to command an offense. He knew how to rise to the occasion. A lot of clutch moments in the fourth quarter, not just that season, but throughout his career. Obviously, the injuries played a huge factor in that, and obviously, I think that's a huge factor in '86 and '87, where this team didn't continue to potentially win more Super Bowls, was the health of the quarterback, and thus guys like Doug Flutie and Mike Tomczak and guys like that at the quarterback position. So what was it for you watching Jim McMahon play? Was this guy one of the top 10, 12 quarterbacks of his era? Or was it more of the pedestrian statistics if you look at his career statistics? Because like the one thing that stands out to me, and yes, this was a defensive oriented team and all that, we've talked about that, his win-loss percentage, and I know quarterback wins isn't really a stat, but his win-loss percentage in the mid-'80s, when he was on the field, the Bears record was astronomically good.
Yeah, I think the thing about him was instinct, feel, ability to adjust. It was off the charts, as good as anybody I've ever seen. Um, he didn't have the physical ability that a lot of quarterbacks had. And as you said, he couldn't stay healthy. I think if he had stayed healthy, the Bears would have won at least two more Super Bowls. But he couldn't stay on the field, and that cost him and it cost them. And it was a source of a lot of discontentment over the years too. So look, if Caleb Williams had Jim McMahon's feel for the game, you put him straight in the Hall of Fame. I mean, that's how special all of that was. And to me, that's really what makes the quarterback. And that those kinds of things, the ability to kind of grasp the game at the proper moment, the knowing when a guy is going to break, understanding what a defensive coordinator is trying to do to you, all of those things. He had like a sixth sense, and it was really what made him special and what made that offense work.
Yeah, and I just looked it up. From 84 to 88, Jim McMahon's record when he was on the field and he started a game 36-5, which is just an absolutely insane record. So let me ask you just two more here, Dan. And the first one is heading into the season, because I don't think that's something we think about too much. We think about afterwards and everything this team accomplished, winning the Super Bowl, of course. But heading into the season before, they'd gone 10-6, a solid record, but they did make it to the NFC Championship game before the Niners ousted them in that game. What were the expectations for this team going in? Like, did people consider this a Super Bowl contender? Did people think this is just more of maybe a playoff team? Like, where was this team in kind of the national landscape in August of 1985?
Oh, there were very high expectations for the Bears. There was a lot of enthusiasm for the team. I think you looked at what they did in '84 and kind of what their character was, what their mental makeup was, their determination. They were at the point when a lot of their young players were coming into their own. It was very obvious. They had that great draft class of 1983, one of the great draft classes in their history, really, any history, with Jim Covert, Willie Gault, and Mark Bortz, Richard Dent, Tom Thayer. These guys were all just kind of starting to feel it in '85, and it was very evident. And they were joining, guys who are already kind of established stars like Hampton and Walter Payton and McMichael and Fensick. So it was the perfect time for that team to be as good as it could ever be.
And let me ask you with this, because I think this is the one thing that is really, really special about this team. And it's the postseason run. Of course, they beat the Giants 21-0, Rams 24-0, Patriots 46-10. And obviously, when you add everything up and you have a total of 91-10, you're talking about absolutely dominating playoff caliber football teams. But taking the offensive performance aside, the defense and special teams, so forget field goals. I'm just talking about the Sean Gale, we'll call it a punt return against the Giants. But the defense itself had Sean Gale score, had Wilbur Marshall score against the Rams, had the Reggie Phillips pick six in the Super Bowl with a safety as well. The defense outscored their opponents 23-10. And that 7 points was a garbage touchdown in the fourth quarter of the Super Bowl. The dominance of this defense, that they were outscoring their opponents in every game, is one of the most insane stats that I think will just never be duplicated. And I think that dominance of that postseason run, to me, is where, when you sit there and say greatest teams of all time, and people say, oh, you can't compare eras, and you got the Steel Curtain, and you got the Montana Niners and Brady Patriots and all that. But a run like the Bears had in that postseason is something that I think really separates this team and puts their mark as potentially the greatest single season team of all time.
Yeah, it's a great point. That team really peaked at the right time. And it probably was helped to that peak by what happened on that Monday night in Miami, because I think they needed a good slap in the face, and they got one by Dan Marino that night. And, it helped them kind of redirect their course, refocus, and start that march to where they just kept getting better and better and better. And if the Super Bowl wasn't the last game, if they played a 17-game season back then or whatever, and they kept going, I mean, they might have gotten better, better, better. That was just how it was going. And they stayed healthy, which obviously doesn't always happen, and that was a key. But I think they really. There was no stopping them, and everybody knew it. They certainly knew it, and you got to the point where you almost felt sorry for the team they had to play.
Yeah, you really did with the punishment that defense laid out. Is it the greatest? Just quick answer. Is it the greatest single season team of all time in your eyes?
Well, I think uh, that's a tough question.
It's an impossible question.
It's an impossible question, but I mean, I haven't seen one that was more dominant than them for sure. And you know, th- they did everything very well. I mean, as you said earlier, they weren't a great passing team, but most teams weren't in those days. I mean, obviously the Dolphins that I just mentioned were kind of on the verge of becoming one, and there were some teams that were ahead of others in that regard, and the Bears were not one of them. But you couldn't do everything anyway. I mean, there's only so many ways to go at it, and they did enough in so many phases to consider them as dominant as any team I've ever seen.
Well, there you go. He is Dan Pompei from The Athletic, longtime Chicago sports writer, and really Chicago sports historian, especially with the Chicago Bears. Dan, thanks for so much time. Really appreciate you helping me kick off this series, 85 at 40. Enjoy the season here. Maybe this Bears team 40 years later can make some noise.
Maybe we'll finally get something else to talk about besides the 85 Bears, right?
Exactly. Thanks so much, Dan.
Okay, thanks.
All right, there it is. Dan Pompei, 85 at 40. Bill Zimmerman, thanks so much. We'll see you next time. Bear down.